One of my favourite gifts to buy families when they have a newborn is from a range of books entitled Little People, Big Dreams. It's inspiring stories of influential people over the last few years and throughout history, and one of my favourites is the book about Rosa Parks. It talks about the stories that a young Rosa Parks grew up around, the environment that she grew up in. And it also talks about the heart of justice that Rosa Parks had to resist and challenge the racial injustice that she faced daily. The perspective of people such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement modelled to the world the teaching of Jesus, highlighting the importance of integration and equality over segregation and non-violent resistance. Martin Luther King knew that this non-violent approach would not come easy to many. Dr. King and other leaders set about setting up training schools for young men and women who wanted to join the sit-ins. There were after-school practice sessions where the students would have to endure and overcome whatever was thrown at them, to practice responding to this violence with patience and this hatred with love. Dr. King was trying to set a framework where people learnt in the area of following Jesus' teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, practicing so that when they got into the places of brokenness, when they got into the places of hatred, when they got into the places of conflict, their well-rehearsed practice enabled them to resist the way of the world. They modelled the importance and the power of practice. A movement of Jesus followers bringing a transformation through beauty, peace, love, and justice. The way of the kingdom. And they saw change. That's what the way of the kingdom brings, change. And don't we long to see that change too? In our cities, our homes, our workplaces, our schools. So couldn't we use this type of training again? If we're to be the next series of little people with big dreams, what do the practices look like for us? And I don't mean re-downloading the Couch to 5K app that's gathering dust and taking up way too much storage on my phone, or going to find that sourdough starter pack from lockdown number 1, or even for me, acknowledging that yet another year has gone by where I still haven't learned how to ride a bike, or invested in some stabilizers. I'm sorry, everyone, I know. But I mean to practice and to train. Practices are behaviours and disciplines that help us grow and develop in relationship with Jesus. And you will have individual behaviours and practices that make you who you are. Some of these will have been formed by Jesus and some of them might not. I remember vividly hearing the passage read earlier as a child, the story of the wise and the foolish builder. But it is so much more than a kid's story. There is such a greater depth to it. Two people could read this passage and both of them love it. Both of them love the story, but one of them puts it into practice and one of them doesn't. Both hear the profound message of Jesus and one of them acts on it and one of them doesn't. One tries to build on solid ground and one just leaves it. These two people could be sat in the same row at church and hear the same message, but only one applies it. And then something significant happens in their life, and one of them withstands the storm, whereas the other one crumbles. Why is it that we can both hear this same message and love it, but one goes away and builds on the solid ground and one does not? Because one was focusing their life on the teaching of Jesus, and the other the way of the world. One's foundation was rooted in the transformational perspective of God, and the other the worries of the world. I'm someone who can struggle with anxiety, with fear, with worry. Often this can even be daily. But I find that the practices that Jesus talks about through prayer, through solitude, through community really helps me. It helps me focus towards the fearlessness of Jesus and less the pattern of the world that I can so easily get caught up in. But why are these practices important? Now stay with me on this one. But have you ever noticed that a big cauliflower looks exactly the same as a little snap of the cauliflower, a little sprig of the cauliflower? The little one still reflects and mirrors the larger one. And why is that? That's because the smaller one is a fractal of the larger mass. The smaller one looks exactly like the bigger one. It's a never-ending pattern of the small reflecting the larger mass. If we work on our own smaller fractal to look more like Christ, we then impact and affect those around us. We work on looking more like Jesus. The larger body of ourselves, the church, starts to look more and more like Jesus. How you embrace doing what Jesus did has an effect. It matters. Over the last few weeks, John has been looking at the vision of Jesus and the picture of the kingdom of God, refocusing our desires and cares around God himself. Once we grasp an understanding of the person Jesus and the potential of the kingdom on earth, we need to think through what part we have to play in that. We need to think through what our fractal looks like. I've often found that the value and the currency of the world looks to what we earn, and we're taught that from a really young age. I used to do all right in school reports. Often I'd get told that I talk too much, which is not a surprise, but I do all right in the effort section. I'd probably get around an A. But when we headed over to the achievement section, my grades started to look more like around C. But bear in mind that when we look at practices of God, God isn't in the business of collecting A's. He's not looking for our A's in achievement. He focuses on our intention, our motivation to follow him. I can often set my expectations to a perfect standard when it comes to habits and practices. So my go-to wording is, I'm trying to do this and I'm trying to do that. But I've come to understand that if I always go with that mindset, I'm always going to fail. Instead, I've found it more successful to talk in terms of practices. I can claim the title of a good Christian if I use the right language or if I listen to the right podcasts. But practicing the way of Jesus looks a lot more like training, admitting when we haven't done so well at our practices. It's a commitment to learning and to developing. If we want to become more like Jesus, we have to do what he did. But how? There are so many good things available to us, different practices available to us, and they can be categorized into two different areas: engagement and disengagement. Disengagement is the practice of withdrawing from the busyness of the world. Even in lockdown, it still manages to be busy. Things such as solitude, silence, fasting, intimacy with God, listening, Sabbath. These specifically target your inner life, your heart, your mind, your soul. And Johnny and John looked at these areas in quite a good amount of detail in our Take Stock and Take Heart series. So I highly recommend checking them out if you haven't already. And last week, John highlighted our priority being with Jesus, to disengage and to find our rhythm with him. My disengagement training plan looks like reading the New Testament in a year with the Bible plan, and for my alarm to go off at midday, daily saying the Lord's Prayer. As Christians, our walk with Jesus isn't that of individualism, but one that is a calling into family. The Sermon on the Mount talks about being both salt and light in the earth. But without salt or light touching anything, they negate their purpose. We don't want to remain huddled together, but we want to engage and actively engage in the world around us. Practices of engagement look at bringing God's kingdom into this world. Practices of engagement teach us how to engage in the world the way that Jesus did, through generosity, celebration, worship, community, prayer. Now, you could read this list and rule them out because of current regulations. We can't worship together, so there's no point. We can't be in a community together because someone can't come round to my house for a cup of tea. And I'm a northerner, I totally understand that frustration. But Jesus isn't on hold until we can hug one another again. There are more engagement practices than I'm going to highlight today, but I'm going to particularly look at 3 different areas of engagement. Firstly, worship. Worship looks at recognising and celebrating who Jesus is. One of the ways we do this is through singing. When we worship God, our perspective changes. When we express our gratitude for who God is and what He is doing in and through us, we gain a greater understanding of who He is. We gain a greater understanding of who we are. I just encourage you, however you're feeling today, to engage, to step into the freedom that worship brings. It can bring you individually and also all of us as a body collectively. Now, one of my other favourite practices, which I doubt will be a surprise to many, is the practice of community. I would have found this year a lot more difficult if it wasn't for the community around me. The incredible people who have encouraged me, who have prayed with me, and who have turned up to enforced fun on Zoom. I'm sorry for anyone who I've made do that. And we started our table last week. We all met on Alpha last term, and then we've decided to start a table. And I have loved getting to know people I may not have known a year ago. What I found is authentic and deep-rooted community, which I think is quite a unique gift that we have in the church against our culture. To go further than surface-level conversation, to stand alongside one another, is a trait I am so grateful for when I reflect on the last year in lockdown, but also the last few years since I moved to Southampton. And finally, the practice of generosity, which we have seen as a church in abundance over the past few months and year. People have been giving freely and joyfully their time, their resources to God, building His kingdom and helping those in our city that are in need. We have seen this with Love Christmas and Love Your Neighbour, amongst so much else. And one of the ways I have loved sharing in generosity is by making people birthday boxes for their birthday. I've seen it as an opportunity to celebrate those who have helped me through the last year, and I can make them a unique and tailored box of presents that I know that they would love. In an unknown time, helping people understand that they are known, that they are celebrated, can be so important. But that is just one example of how to give generously right now. Maybe there's something better suited to you, to your circumstances, where you could reach out to give to your neighbour, to write a nice note to your colleague. And this community is sustained by people's financial giving through their generosity, which I think is incredible. Your giving might be in this city, or it might be further away. But giving is not focused on ourselves, but it's focused away from us. It's a way of giving ourselves away. And it is true that it's better to give than to receive. As you practice generosity, it is inevitable that you will come to understand that. My engagement training plan currently looks like trying to tailor celebrating people generously, to commit to tables, and to pray for my family and friends daily at 1 p.m. We each have our own way of expressing these practices and others. Some might prefer practices of engagement and others practices of disengagement. But try to balance the practices that might come naturally to you, and also to challenge yourself with one that might come slightly less naturally. So what practice can you pick up? Just before we pray, I want to acknowledge one potential pitfall in the world of practices. When I fall out of rhythm or my practices, or I get stuck in that mentality, I can often find myself thinking, try harder, get tired, quit, and start to feel guilty or shame around not completing them. But that isn't the voice of Jesus. Maybe it's the voice of an assertive teacher. That cycle of try, get tired, quit, guilt, shame. But Jesus says in Matthew, walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. You start to recognize that voice of try harder, get tired, do better, quit, isn't the voice of Jesus. When you get to know who Jesus is through the scriptures, you will start to hear things and see things aligned with the character of Jesus. You start to know God's voice and recognize his voice, because there will be times when you start to notice thoughts, or you might never have thoughts that you might never have had, or decisions that you might never have made. And that's what we see when we hear about Dr. King's practices. Practice and training changes your perspective. The idea of training is that someone suggests a practice, but ultimately you decide. And that's not about guilt, but that's about progress. So what will you do? How can you this week do what Jesus did in generosity, in community, worship, in prayer? What would our community look like if we each committed to practicing the way of Jesus daily? What would our city look like? What could our nation look like? The goal isn't to complete practices, but that every time we practice disengaging to be in his presence and engaging together to play our part, that we walk away more aware of how good our God is. More aware of the one who carries the burden with us. And more aware of the impact that has on the earth.